Welcome back. In this video, let's talk about how to set up staging environments in Microsoft Azure App Service. In the previous video, we deployed our Spring Boot application to Microsoft Azure. Our customers and users can access the application. They're happy. However, with our current deployment setup, the Spring Boot application is deployed right into the production deployment, like this. Well, deploying to production directly is okay for a proof of concept project, or a demo, or a tutorial, but this is not the best practice. Why? So assume we add some new features to our application and want to deploy a new version of our Spring Boot application to the production. As you saw in the previous video, deploying and starting a Spring Boot container takes a minute or two for our simple Spring Boot project. For some large applications, deployment may take even longer. During that time, the application is not available. It is called downtime for our customers and users. As you can see, they're upset because our application is not available before the new deployment is done. Moreover, you may also want to get a chance to validate the updates and changes before you really review it to the entire world, right? So deploying right into the production is not recommended. Instead, what is recommended is to set up a staging environment. This is what we're going to do in this video. Now there are two independent environments, staging and production. The customers and users are accessing the production environment. They're happy. Now, when we deploy a new version of the application, we'll first deploy to the staging site. Please note that it will not interrupt the normal access to the already deployed application in the production site. We can then send the staging site to the QA team, the product manager, or some customers to let them validate and play with the new version before it actually goes live to production. When we're ready to do a release, we can swap the two environments. Here, we totally eliminate the downtime, and this is also called zero downtime deployments. It is highly recommended. Okay, then let's do that in Microsoft Azure. It turns out that Azure provides a deployment feature called deployment slots that can support multiple environments like staging and production. Let's toggle over to Azure Portal. Here is the dashboard of our Hogwarts Artifacts Online web application. In the left navigation menu, under Deployment, there is something called Deployment Slots. So let's open that. Okay, in order to use this feature, we have to upgrade to a standard or premium plan. Right now, I am on a basic plan. So I need to upgrade to either a standard or premium. So let me go to the standard one, S1. Okay, so here is a disclaimer. I want to warn you here. Whenever you work with a cloud provider like Azure or Amazon AWS or Google Cloud or Heroku, you may be required to provide your credit card number. That means you need to understand how you get charged and properly manage the cost so you don't get a surprise bill later in the month. This happened both to my students and myself before. It's not fun at all. So when you are done, turn off everything, and also you can choose to set up some cost alerts. Understanding that, let me upgrade to a standard plan for the purpose of this tutorial. All right. Let's go back to deployment slots and refresh. At this moment, there is only one development slot running here, and it is labeled as production. Since it's running, we can test it. So let's go to Overview and browse the current application. For example, we're accessing API v1 artifacts. So it's working. So it's returning flag true, code 200, message, and also all those artifacts. All right. As you see here, deployment slots are independent apps with their own host names, contents, and configurations. They don't interrupt each other. So let's create a slot for the staging site. You can do this either using Azure CLI or in this portal. So let's go ahead and add slot and give it name. I just call it staging. Please note that there is a new domain name generated for this staging site. It is Hogwarts Artifacts Online Staging Azure Websites.net. And do not clone settings. And let's click Add. It is going to take a while because Azure is creating another web app for us. Okay, so let's close here. And now we have two slots. One is production and one is staging. By default, the traffic percentage is set to 0 for the new slot, with all the customer and user traffic routed to the production slot. And that makes a lot of sense. But you also can route some traffic to the staging site. For example, here I will put 10%. Now in this case, we route 10% of traffic to the staging server, maybe to validate some changes, or even warm up the application before we swap it into the production, or maybe evaluate the API response time and other metrics to make sure it is ready to go to production. So the whole point is that to make sure it is good to go to the production. But now let me change it back. So next, let's click into this Hogwarts Artifacts Online staging. All right, as you can see, this dashboard is very similar to the dashboard of the production one. Since each slot is its own independent app, this is not surprising. Now remember, now we're going to deploy to this site, to this staging site. Deployment slots have their own published profile. So since now we're going to deploy to this staging site, that means we need to update the Azure Web App Publish profile secret that we saved on GitHub. So let's download this new published profile. Okay. As you can see, the first file contains published profile for the production slot, and the second one is the staging slot. So let's double click. And let's copy this. Then go to GitHub. And now we need to update the secret. Click Edit. Paste. And click Update Secret. Okay. So the secret is updated. Recall that this published profile is like the login credentials for Azure. It is needed by GitHub Actions because GitHub Actions will deploy to this site on Azure. Next, let's go to IntelliJ and modify the build and deploy workflow. To simulate a real-world scenario and also make things interesting, let's make some changes to the current version of Spring Boot application. I'm not sure if you noticed that. A small bug showed up in the previous video when we test the deployed Spring Boot application. Let me show you. Let's go to the browser. In this case, since API v1 artifacts does not need any authentication, so it's fine. But when I change it to wizards, now remember, wizards does require authentication. So if I press enter, now I got this full authentication is required to access this resource. But look at the code and the message, 500 and a server internal error occurs. That doesn't really make sense because this is supposed to be a 401 and the message may be login is required or something like that. So let's go to IntelliJ and fix this problem and push this new build to the staging, but not the production. In that case, you can also see the difference between staging and production. Let's do it. Let's go back to IntelliJ. And I know where the problem is. Let's go to src, main, Java. Under system, there is an exception handler advice. So right here. Now this is the class that is responsible for handling all the exceptions. And it seems like that one is handled by the last one. It falls through to the last exception handler. That's why we have this 500 and a server internal error occurs. Okay? And we need to handle that exception explicitly. To do that, let's create a branch. Remember, always start with a branch. Don't make modifications to main branch directly. So git branch, let's name it login credentials missing handling. And let's switch to that branch. Okay. Okay, let's fix this problem. All right, here. And we can borrow the piece of code here, copy, and paste. Now, it turns out that if no login credentials are provided, then Spring Security will throw an insufficient authentication exception. And we need to explicitly handle that here. Change the name. All right, so just double check, because be careful when you do copy and paste. So this handler is handling this one, insufficient authentication exception. And this is 401, which is good. And that's the incoming parameter, the exception thrown by Spring Security. So flag is false, 401. And we're going to change this one to login credentials are missing. Okay. It's a pretty simple fix. Let's come back to the deployment. Recall that now we're no longer deploying to the production slot. Instead, we're deploying to the staging slot. And how do we let GitHub Actions know that we want to deploy to a different slot? So we have to modify the workflow. Let's open the workflow file. It's right here. So this is the current workflow. There are two jobs, build, and let's go all the way down to the second job, deploy. So here, by default, Azure/Web Apps deploy action will deploy to the production slot. Now, so we have to add one line here, and to explicitly tell it, we're going to deploy to this slot, staging. You don't have to write Hogwarts artifacts online in front, just staging. That's the name of the slot we just created. Then let's launch the tests locally. It's always a good idea to test locally since we introduced some changes into the code repository. Okay, I fast forwarded a little bit so you don't have to watch it testing. All tests passed, which is very good. Now, it's also a good idea that we test locally to make sure that now we can really handle that insufficient authentication exception. So let me launch the project. Okay, then let's go to the browser or to Postman and let's test this. Since this is simple, let's just test in the browser. So this time we have to use localhost. But remember, since we changed the port from 8080 to 80, so we have to change it to 80. Now, since it's 80, you can leave it out. Just localhost API v1 artifacts. Okay. Now, so this is locally, it's fine. Then let me change it to wizards and press return. Okay, so now it's asking me to input the username and password, and we don't want to do that here, so let's do cancel. And it's giving us 401, login credentials are missing, full authentication is required to access this resource. Okay, cool. So everything works fine locally. Now I believe it's time for me to push the changes to GitHub and let GitHub Actions do a build and deployment. Let's do that. Let's go back to IntelliJ and turn off this application. Then let's go to terminal. So git status. So here we have the two changes. Then git add. Okay. Git commit. Update the exception handler advice class so that we can handle the insufficient authentication exception. Then git push. All right, let's go to GitHub. All right, so we have this login credentials missing handling branch. Let's compare and open a pull request. So here are the changes. We added an exception handler, and we also modified the Azure Web Apps deploy YAML file. Okay, so create pull request. And recall that opening a pull request will trigger the Java CI with Maven workflow. Okay, so let's go to Actions to look at some details.
$2,000 later.
Okay, finally the build is done. Let's go to the pull request. And we're ready to merge. So merge. Now remember, when a pull request is merged, that will trigger the second workflow, the one we modified. Confirm merge. Let's go to Actions and watch the build process. So first build, then deploy. But this time we're deploying to the staging slot instead of the production slot. Okay, the build is done. Now we're ready to deploy. Great, the deployment is also successful. Next, Let's go to Azure portal. This is the current production. If I press reload, we're still getting the same result, okay? Now at the same time, the deployment is happening on the staging side. So let's click browse. Now as you can see, now it's not available. There's a downtime on the staging side. If a user is accessing the production side, everything's fine. There's no interruption. But the staging side is still loading. Note that the domain name is different. Now we have the staging appended to Hogwarts-artifacts-online. So for example, here, I also can see artifacts and it's working, right? But this one still is loading. But the good thing is our customers and users, they're still accessing this production environment, while this one is still loading. So let's wait a sec.
2,000 years later.
So the staging side is ready. So let's come here. Now, as you can see, we already see the effect, right? So it's asking us for the login credentials. So let's click cancel. That gave us the new exception. Let's test some APIs. API v1. Let's first try artifacts. Okay, so this one does not need login. But then if I change to wizards and press return, okay, so it's asking me for username and password, cancel. And now we have this false 401 login credentials missing. Remember, here we're on the staging side. But at this moment, the current production side is still running the old version of our Spring Boot application. False 500, a server internal error occurs. Okay, that's great. Remember what I said before? For this staging site, we can send it to the QA team, the product manager, or some customers, and let them validate and play with the new version before it goes live to production. Let's assume that that is done and the release is approved. Let's go back to Azure portal. Here. Let's go to the deployment slots. As you can see, both are running. Then we're ready for a swap. Basically, that swaps the contents between the two sites. So let's click swap. All right. By default, the source is the staging site. The source will be swapped into the target, which is the production site. Oh, by the way, you can have more than one staging site. So for example, we can have staging 1, staging 2, and staging 3, but in this case, I only have one staging site. Okay, then down here in the config changes, and we didn't change any configuration, but you could. So for example, maybe in the staging site, we're using a different version of JDK than the one used in the current production site. That change will be shown in this section. Basically, it is a diff, old value and new value. Everything looks good. Let's do a swap. Click swap. And this will take a while. I want to mention that during swapping, the production side is still available to the customers and users. That's very incredible. Okay, successfully completed swap between slot staging and slot production. Let's close this. How do I know that? So let's go to the two sites again. First, let's test this one. Hogwarts Artifacts Online. This is the production site. Remember, this JSON message you see here was produced by the Spring Boot application before the swapping, the old version. Now let's click reload the page. All right, look at here. Now we have the new version on the production side. Let me click cancel. We're getting 401, login credentials are missing. Then what about the staging side? This is the JSON message before the swapping, right? So after the swap, guess what? The staging side has the content from the production site, the old version. Let's verify that by reloading the page. Oh, we're getting this 500 server internal error occurs JSON message. So, as you can see, the contents between the staging and production site get swapped. We didn't lose the previous production version. It is now in the staging site. An advantage of this approach is that if the changes swapped into the production slot are not as we expect, we can perform the same swap immediately to get our last known good site back. Okay, now let's go back to IntelliJ and let's git switch to main. All right, then git pull. All right, good. Our local main branch is synchronized. Now, let's go to the slides and talk about the benefits of using staging environments. So here, let's talk about the benefits of deploying to a staging site. Number one, you have a chance to validate app changes in a staging deployment slot before swapping it with the production slot. That's always a good idea. Number two, you can eliminate downtime when deploying the app, so your customers and users are happy. They are not interrupted because of the deployment. Number three, as I said before, if the changes swapped into the production slot are not as you expect, you can perform the same swap immediately to get your last known good site back. If you want to know more about the staging environments, I also encourage you to read the documentation provided by Microsoft Azure. The link is available on this slide and also in the description of this video. In summary, whenever possible, use deployment slots when deploying a new production build. Deploy your app to a staging environment, validate your changes, and do smoke tests. When you're ready, you can swap your staging and production slots. The swap operation warms up the necessary worker instances to match your production scale, thus eliminating downtime. Okay, I hope you learned something today. In the next video, let's provision a MySQL database server on Microsoft Azure and use that to replace our current in-memory H2 database. See you there.